Just a little bit about James. James Heywood is the national organiser for the BTO JNCC RSPB Breeding Bird Survey, to give it its full title, I think. James has been interested in various aspects of the natural world since he can remember, and trained in zoology and comparative anatomy, embarking in the late 2000s in a career in paleobiology. Have I got that right? Sounds like Indiana Jones to me. You correct me. A stint working in clinical medicine, and most recently as a field ornithologist, led him to the BTO in 2022, where he is now the 5th custodian of the UK's gold standard monitoring scheme for birds. His favourite bird is the wheatear, a harbinger of spring and symbolic of some of his favourite UK holiday destinations, and certainly a bird we're all looking forward to seeing shortly, hopefully. Certainly got the weather for it. So please welcome James Heywood. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for the introduction, and thank you for having me. When I first started this talk, I made this talk last year, because last year the BBS celebrated its 30th anniversary. And I thought, okay, 30 years in 30 minutes, that's a nice ring to it. But when I was first putting the talk together, I thought, actually, it would make a lot of sense to talk a little bit about before and a little about what happened after, or what we might have happen in the future. So it's going to end up being something in the region of about 90 years in 30 minutes. But don't worry, this isn't going to be like one of those kind of holiday sort of photo snaps. I'm not going to take you on a year-by-year thing. So how I'll do it is I'll spend a bit of time talking about the origins of the survey, what went before it, what drove the need for a new survey. I'll talk about 30 years, but rather than going through each 30 years one by one, I'm going to talk about what the survey has achieved, what it's currently achieving, and also, and I'm always very keen to talk about this, is the achievers, so the people behind it, most notably volunteers. And then towards the very end, we'll give you a few sort of glimpses of where the survey could go in the future. So, nodding back to my failed attempt to become a paleobiologist, I like to include this slide because it sort of does three things really. It reminds me of that early chance in my career. It also reminds me that birds ultimately are just a very highly specialised form of feathered dinosaur. And it also reminds me, or colleagues of mine have often said that BTO staff and volunteers have sometimes, very unfairly in my view, been referred to in sort of dinosaurian terms. But just to say that my experience in the 2.5 years I've been at BTO is far from the truth. So let's fast forward by 150 million years or so, and we come to another survey. Actually, it's a survey that preceded the breeding bird survey, the common bird census. I don't know how many people in the room know about it or have ever done it, a few nods. But I think it can justifiably be considered the sort of vanguard, not just in Britain or in Europe, but also across the world in terms of monitoring terrestrial breeding birds. It ran from 1962 to all the way to 2000, and just as a sort of quick glimpse of what was involved, it was used as a territory mapping method. It's still a method used today in many contexts. And as you can see here from just one map produced on one survey, it was required a high degree of skill, time, and not just time on the survey itself, but repeated visits. So here's an example of a woodland plot that was done that would have been done over 10 visits. The survey was set up because even in the early 60s we had an appreciation that the way we were farming our landscape was having a detrimental impact on birds. And so it was really set up for that monitoring aim. But of course, very soon afterwards, they increased the number of sites to include woodlands as well. And its outputs, I mean, it was, for one thing, it was an extremely successful survey, produced a wide range of outputs and a wide range of really important findings, including a few seminal works here, The Farming of Birds from 1986, but also led us a greater understanding about how our woodlands, how changes in woodland management were affecting birds, of course things like drainage, wading declines and raptor persecution. But I think even by around about the 1980s, there was a realisation that the survey wasn't perfect. Mostly, for three reasons really. One, it was very biased towards England, I suppose because of the farmland emphasis, maybe an emphasis on the more arable style farmland, and also just purely out of access. So it was both geographically biased, it was necessarily biased towards certain habitats, so those farmland and woodland I mentioned, but also one of the important things is those sites was selected by volunteers themselves. There was no notion of them being randomly selected. And as you can see from the plot on the right, so on the left there, the number of plots being surveyed year on year started to decrease, and so the amount of information we were getting was declining. The big ask that we were making of volunteers to do the survey was clearly having something of an impact. So a few people came together and said, right, we need to do something about this, and it was time for a change. We needed a survey that was doing similar things, asking similar questions, but was much less time consuming for the volunteers doing it. Not just in terms of the actual going out in the field and collecting the data, but one thing I didn't mention is that one of those territory maps that I mentioned, not only were they collecting the data in the field, but they were then going away and analysing and converting those into actual numbers of territories, which is in itself a separate skill. So try and reduce the amount of effort being used by volunteers. We needed to be more representative, so not only more species and more habitats, which kind of they're two sides of the same coin in many respects. You go and sample more habitats and you'll be able to capture data on more species, but also just more geographically widespread. So how could we get more people to go and survey in, say, Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland? So I think we can rightly say that BBS has a sort of series of 3 and possibly 4 founding fathers. So Stephen Bailey, who's now recently retired, but still has kind of emeritus status at BTO. He's responsible not only for setting up the BBS and coming up with a new design, but for many of BTO's, the changes in the way BTO, with our partners, so JNCC and RSPB, monitor our birds. And not only just coming up with new and interesting ways of collecting data, for example, setting up bird track or migration watch as it was known, but pulling together all of that information from different styles of survey, different types of information to a kind of integrated population model. So he, along with Richard Gregory, who's now RSPB, and John Marchant, some people have said, why have I said John kind of walking away into the distance here? Some people have suggested that because he was the original, or he was the main organiser for the common bird census, that he was somehow had got the huff and he was walking off. But far from it, that was just the best picture I could find. But yeah, he was, of course, because he was in charge of the CBC, that he was integral to the process of setting up the new survey. The 4th person is Ian Carter, and unfortunately I don't have a picture of him, but anyway. So these 3 people, they got together and they came up with some requirements that the sites would be selected at least initially randomly. Of course, there were always going to be an element of selection by the volunteer once that square had been laid out in front of them. Require very fewer visits instead of 10, much reduced to that. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, the requirement for almost no analytical input. You know, we want our volunteers to collect data. The analysis can happen somewhere else. There was about 2 or 3 years of development, and in particular some field trials that compared 2 major types of field protocols. That's the point count on top and the line transect underneath. And one of the people who was instrumental in doing a lot of that work was my boss, Dawn Balmer, who a lot of you will have at least heard of, if not have met. A really instrumental figure in British ornithology. And ultimately it was the line transect, the one underneath, which, as you'll see, is the one that won out. And so in 1994, BBS was born, and this is a bit of an estimate, but we're pretty happy with this, I think, is that the first bird that was ever recorded on a BBS square was at something like 7:05 in the morning on Monday, the 4th of April 1994, on this rather unassuming square, right at the boundary between Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire and Leicestershire. We're pretty certain about the time and the date of the bird. We've had a bit of guesswork, but I think given that what BBS followed in the footsteps of, namely the CBC, with its emphasis on the fund, I think we've put our colours on the mast of Skylark. And of course, as you'll see in a minute, Skylark is possibly undergoing something of a resurgence at the moment. And so what better bird to start with? I'm conscious that whilst this is a joint BTO and Hertshire Bird Club conference, that many people in the room will know how it is, but for those of you who don't, I'll try and explain how it works very quickly. So 2 volunteers go out to squares which themselves are randomly selected, but you as a volunteer have an element of choice as to which one you visit. You go out there twice a year and you walk these 2 roughly parallel 1 kilometre transects. The ideal is on the left, the reality is on the right. That's my square at the head of the ooze washes, and you do that twice, and you record all the birds that you see and hear against so-called distance bands in a method that falls under the umbrella of what we call distance sampling. There are two mandatory bits. There's the birds, of course, obviously, but also we were asking our volunteers to record habitat, some simple habitat data. And there are some optional bits too. So we asked not only what bird was it and where was it, but how did you first come by it? That's what we call detection time. And then for about 90% of squares, volunteers also count the number of mammals that they've seen. And as a separate element, this is not something you do at the same time, but as a separate survey, you can use the same square or the same transects to contribute to an entirely different monitoring scheme, which is the UK butterfly monitoring scheme. The sub-survey, if you like, is called the Wider Countryside Butterfly Survey. And just as a plug whilst I'm here, the UK BMS is having its 50th anniversary. It's the longest running monitoring survey of any insect group in the world. So volunteers can go out and collect data on a separate survey with very much little effort, just 2 extra visits in July and August. For mammals, we are able to produce population trends for 9 of those species, kind of easy to identify, relatively easy to see ones. And then here's the Wider Countryside Butterfly Survey and its contribution to a bigger the UK BMS, which, as I say, is 50 this year. In terms of organisation, there's a national organiser. That's me at the moment, but I have 4 predecessors, and I think probably the most famous one, as far as this audience is concerned, is the one at the bottom, Sarah Harris. Not just because she was the BBS organiser for 8 years, the longest serving out of any of those, but because I think I've got this right, her position as the honorary secretary of the Ryan Meads Ringing Group, which I think is not a million miles from here. Sarah is now the Seabird Monitoring Programme national organiser. And I think all of these people have ultimately stayed within conservation. So Richard Bashford went on to work for RSPB. Mike Raven is now an ecologist working professionally, working for local authorities in Dublin. Kate Risley went on to work for the Garden Bird Watch team and is now working for Natural England. So as you can see here, each one of them has a sort of a tenure of about 7 or 8 years. So we're afraid everyone's going to have to put up with me for at least another 5.5 if it goes according to the same plan. So we're sort of a bit like a general that sits comfortably in our mess quarters behind enemy line, sort of well behind the lines. But the people doing the work at the coalface, mixing my metaphors horribly, are this group, the regional network, who we sometimes refer to as kind of, I guess, a super volunteer. We have a few members of them here: Martin, Murray, and Amanda. I think you were at least a member of that network, if you are presently. So these are the people who are out there getting the volunteers to do our work. And for those of you during the break, please go visit the BTO's stand at the back and learn more about some of our other surveys. So they're the ones in direct contact with volunteers. I have very little contact with individual volunteers and squares myself. It's the people like Martin and others who are doing that bulk of the work. So these are the people who are, without whom we could not have the success that we have with our surveys, not just BBS. So that's sort of the past, if you like. I want to move on to the kind of the present, if to use the Dickensian analogy, and rather than talk about those individual years, I'm just going to talk about what BBS, what it does, what it's for, what it's achieved. I was very lucky because my head of science, James Pierce Higgins, actually went and did this 3 years ago, because of course during the COVID year we had very little to report on in terms of birds, so we thought we'd use the BBS report to explain what the survey was doing. So the very primary role for BBS is effectively a kind of annual stock take of what terrestrial breeding birds are doing and measuring population change. It does so for about 120 species. That number does grow, but of course as the number of species that we start to produce trends for goes up because of colonisation, or in some cases, particularly around here, you'll be familiar with ringneck parakeets, I'm sure. There are some species for which the BBS will cease to be the right tool to monitor. So things like willow tit will eventually, if under current scenarios, will be the role purely of the rare breed bird handler. In terms of this plot came from a recent paper where we've made our data more publicly accessible. This was just to highlight not only the number of species that BBS monitors, but also just the sheer number of birds. Drawing your attention to the fact that the axis here is actually a logarithmic, so each unit is actually multiplied by 10. So in terms of looking at the number of yellow bars, if you sum that up and look at the number of birds, BBS is effectively monitoring tens of millions of birds within the UK. And I mentioned Skylark a little while ago and saying that it's a suggestion that things are maybe starting to look up for it. One of the reasons for mentioning the CBC at the very beginning was to explain that not only were these two surveys happening one after the other, but we actually managed to run them for a period of about 7 years, overlapping. And the whole reason and the real value behind that is that we get a really long run of understanding about how birds have changed. If we just take this in isolation, so this is BBS data alone, we might think that Skylarks, okay, we know they decline and they may be on the way back. But if you put that in the context of historical declines going right the way back to data collected by CBC, this is a small drop in the ocean, the notion of that baseline, shifting baseline syndrome. So again, just to highlight that the ability to run those surveys concurrently meant that we were able to effectively calibrate one with the other and then produce these joint trends. And those joint trends are important because every year we produce these wild bird indicators, which are used at the top level of government for conservation policy setting. And you can see here out of the different indicator groups that we have 4 out of the 6 are derived from BBS, and of course from CBC. Periodically we have these grander stock takes, multi-taxa indicators in the state of nature. Again, you can see here that BBS is used in that. And we also, every year, submit data to our colleagues in Europe. So the Pan-European Common Bird Monitoring Scheme, PECMS, it's like a contrived acronym there. All of our data is being used, not just within the UK context, but in the context of Europe. And only a year before last, this important publication which highlighted the things that we probably already know are happening in the UK and in the individual countries within Europe, big farm and bird declines, but this is putting it together at a continental scale. It's not just data that we're giving to Europe, we're giving essentially advice. You can see here on the left-hand side the instructions for the BBS, and you can see on the right-hand side the instructions for the same BBS in Poland, that you can see that they bear more than just a passing resemblance from one another. We have a long history at the BTO of passing on our advice and sharing best practice with our colleagues in Europe. As well as data and indicators, it's using the data for assessing conservation priorities, so people familiar with the red listing process that happens for birds, a lot of it is based on BBS data. Greenfinch, I mean that was just the cover for that particular year, but I highlight it here as an example where a bird has gone straight from green to red list on the back of BBS data. I'll explain a little bit more about how that came to be. And on top of all this, so these are all kind of regular outputs, almost annual. As well as that, people are constantly asking us for our data, and as I mentioned, BBS data is now freely available for use and research. But BBS has a long history of supplying researchers with data for questions. I haven't got time to go through all of those now, so I'm just going to go through some of the major themes. So in terms of kind of terrestrial land use change, BBS has a long history of use in research in understanding the effectiveness of agricultural environment schemes, for example. We've published papers on game bird releases, urban population bird declines, and even things as on the impact of roads, which, whilst that seems a bit niche, but that's really important when coming to deciding on where roads are built, particularly when around protected areas. I mentioned greenfinch, the declines, the really rapid and worrying declines around greenfinch and chaffinch as a result of disease. That was something that was picked up initially by BBS, and then more recently the impact of the Usutu virus and blackbird. So that little plot on the left there showing the trend in London, which has always been going down, probably as a result of the general urbanisation, but that real dip at the bottom, on the right-hand side, it is likely to be the signal of the impact of Usutu. And then, in addition to that, there are always papers on specific species. The most recently, our colleagues in RSPB have been producing a lot of work on wind-shack declines. I mentioned protected areas. This is one of BTO's current sort of areas of focus. A couple of years ago, we published a paper in Nature about Nature Ecology and Evolution, as I say, about the role and importance of protected areas. So those are our sites designated for nature on birds. many really important findings from that, but probably the easiest to summarise here is that there's special protection areas, which are those European level designated sites which are protected specifically for birds, are working for the birds which are rarest and least common. So those are the ones that are kind of shaded in the orange and red colours. So things like our woodlark, which is very impressive given that we've got the woodlark survey, or the heathland bird survey with the woodlark, but also our commonest like the Heywood, smaller. The birds for which the SPAs have the least effect are the most common and widespread. So in that respect, SPAs are kind of doing the job they were set out to do, which is to protect the rarer species. More recently, so only last year, we then looked at whether not only does the existence of a protected area work, but does the condition have any impact? And the short answer is yes. So the protected areas that are in more favourable condition generally do better than those that are not. So not only is it important to say that we have to have more protected areas to reach our biodiversity targets, but those protected areas have to be in good condition. So those are the achievements. I could go on a lot longer about that, but I just want to talk now about the people behind BBS, because of course without volunteers, the survey would be very much lower in scope and much less impactful. I had a bit of fun with this, and I'm sorry some of the things have slipped a bit here, when I was coming up with the sort of 30th anniversary of the survey. So I thought I'd go through some of the high level observations or stats about participation in the survey. So over the course of the 30 years, we've had about 9,000 people survey at least one square. So 9,000 is the rough estimate for the size of the English force of the Battle of Agincourt, far outnumbered by the French force, which of course it famously defeated. It generates about 8 million biological bird records specifically for about 300 species. And for those of you of a certain age, that is about the same number of records sold by Oasis of its debut album, which incidentally was also released in 1994. I don't think the Gallagher brothers ever thought that their first major bit of work would ever be compared with a bird monitoring scheme. The number of visits, so that's the number of individual trips that people are going out to their squares, is about the same, made by about 4,000 people to the supermarket every year. That's a slightly contrived one, sorry about that. If we counted just the amount of time people are out there recording and forgetting the travelling and the moving between bits of the different habitat, it's about 300,000 hours, which if you go back in time, takes us to about the early 90s when people were arguing about the poll tax. And then in terms of the distance that people have walked on those transects, it amounts to about 8 times around the Earth. So that's in the whole 30 years. Anyway, a bit of fun there, but the survey has, of course, grown from a relatively low base of 1,500 squares over time. I hope this works. Yes, it does. So for each one of these different squares is the number of individual 1 kilometre squares. Sorry, each square is a 10 kilometre square, and the density of the colour is the number of 1 kilometre squares surveyed, and then we're going through time here. So you can see a few sort of pulses. Oh, sorry, I'll try that again. No, wait. We'll try again. You have sort of little peaks and troughs of activity. No, it's not working. Anyway, the plot on the right-hand side should show us, but in the 2007 Atlas, there was a big kind of growth in coverage as we had more people joining the survey. And then, luckily in 2017, an additional part of the scheme was set up, particularly to help monitoring in Scotland. The other thing you'll notice here is that even though I've said that sites are kind of randomly selected, there is a distinctly non-random element to this, and the number of sites varies in density depending on where you are. One of the things that was first set up at the survey, the likes of Stephen Bailey and Richard Gregory, they said, well, we will give more squares to places that have more people. Let's do that because it means that more people can contribute. We'll take that into account during the analysis phase. So it's not the case that the number of squares across the country is uniform, and it's far from it. But one of the things I always find staggering is that you still have squares right up in the far north and west of Britain, and there are people out there going out to some really far fun places, as we'll see in a minute. Now for some slightly more remarkable kind of observations. We've had 103 people who've surveyed every year of the survey, which I think is a staggering effort. And I suspect a lot of those people were also surveying for the common bird census prior to that. We've had 15 people who've surveyed over 180 visits, so that's the equivalent of 3 squares a year for the full 30 years. And I mentioned those regional organisers at the very beginning. We've had 12 of those who've done the job for the full 30 years as well. Some of whom are also surveyors, but some of whom have just decided to do purely the administrative work, which I think is a really staggering observation. In terms of where those squares are, well, they're sort of a little bit scattered around the country, and we've had a few people who have tackled squares of differing flavours. So we have Dave Jardine at the top right, who's surveyed two of the, I think it's the islands of Colonsay and Ornithology for 30 years. Will Wagstaff is the regional rep for the Isles of Scilly. Quite an easy job for him because there's only 2 squares there, he does it himself. But I think probably the one what I would like to celebrate is Judith Smith here on the right, who surveys the centre of Wigan, which I think, when you're considering about where you want to go every year, twice a year, to get up and go to Wigan town centre and count pigeons or whatever it is, I think is a real tribute to Judith for her commitment. In terms of where those squares are, we've got a mixture. So the map on the right is showing that most people tend to survey the same square. So those are the squares in red. But very occasionally people will go and visit places for 1 or 2 years. And we've got a few people who decide to head up north for, some people refer to them as holiday squares. And one of those people is in the audience today, but that's Amanda, of course. Amanda has been doing the survey, well, now 31 years, because we're on our 31st year, has compiled a staggering 91 visits over 7 squares. You think, well, where are those 7 squares? Because 2 of them are in, I don't actually know if both of them are in Hertfordshire, but anyway, 2 very local to here. Where every year she's been recording pretty much the same assemblage of woodland, farmland, blackcaps and chaffinch, the 2 examples I've drawn out there. Even though BBS, we tend not to say that it's a great a great method for monitoring birds locally. It was redesigned for that. It's kind of designed for big picture stuff. You can see here that the great increase that we've seen in blackcap in the last 30 years has been written small on her own square, and ditto the rise and then decline of chaffinch. But every so often, Amanda and Martin as well have traded in their blackcaps and chaffinches for adventures further north. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about what I mean by upland rovers in a minute. But she traded in those species for at least 5 other squares. I think this one is not Kuik. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation now. Amanda's going to have to help me out here. I think this is the transect that she walks. Just one of them is along this path here, and the other one is further up here. And I think, if I'm correct in saying, she's traded in those sort of woodland species for a few slightly more exotic or slightly more northern ones. We've had ring ouzel, she's had ring ouzel, red grouse, and even, I think, a flock of 121 pinkfeet, which is, I think, quite a rare find on a BBS square. So people like Amanda are going up on their holidays, and they are counting in a sub-scheme of BBS called Upland Rovers. And Upland Rovers was a sort of scheme devised in 2017 to try and boost coverage in these harder to reach, harder to access places in the north and west of Scotland primarily, but also upland areas in the UK. And you can see from the plot on the left just how successful that was. The basic premise was that you didn't have to sign up to a square long term. If you only wanted to visit it just once, then you could. The emphasis was more on getting the samples up rather than keeping that consistency of observation. By doing so, it's led to an increased number of population trends that we can publish for species in Scotland. So these are 5 species that we've got trends for on the back of upland rovers. You might be thinking, well, a few of these are woodland birds, what's that got to do with anything? But of course, a lot of these people are going to not just upland in terms of moorland, what we might consider sort of more montane, like the picture I showed you, but they're also going to all these upland areas where they've got dense conifer plantations, and so a lot of these woodland species are being picked up as well. I put it here as a sort of the title of adaptation, because one of the things that I think is important to stress is that not only has BBS been considered the gold standard breeding survey for terrestrial bird monitoring on the basis of its kind of consistency and year-on-year repetition, it is definitely true that BBS has adapted and has had to adapt. And this is one example of how, by a combination of knowing our volunteers and also using new analytical techniques, how we can adapt. And on the back of the development of the upland rovers, only last year were we able to produce an indicator specifically for the uplands. That was never really possible prior to that point. So that leads me to the future, because of course BBS will have to continue to adapt, not just to the new demands of things like climate change and the new questions being asked of it, but also new technologies. And one of those which I'm sure a lot of people here are already really interested in and probably actively using in one way or another is acoustic data. So one of the problems we have with terrestrial bird monitoring in Britain is that whilst BBS is brilliant for those 120 species, there are still quite a few species where we have breeding populations, but they are in relatively small localised areas, and in particular like greenshank in areas where it's really difficult to get to. And whilst they are seen on average about 12 squares a year, that's not really enough to give us a totally robust population trend. That, if we did, that's what it would look like, but there's a lot of uncertainty around that. So are there other ways of doing this? Well, 2023 we invited 30 people in Scotland to stick out one of those acoustic recorders on their square with a view to comparing what the counts were between, say, the species they count themselves versus what the acoustic detector is picking up. I'm not going into the details of how we've the classifying and the kind of automated nature of that. This is the pattern of detection of greenshank on one square in the Western Isles, and the grey bars show you when a typical human would be going out to doing a breeding bird survey. And you can see here that the grey bar is only sampling a very small number of that. Now you could say that's true of a lot of species, not just greenshank, but it's clear that we could, with this information, and with a bit more work to understand what the biases are, we could do a lot more to see how acoustic data can not replace, absolutely not replace the human surveyor, the human observer, but certainly augment what we can learn, particularly in these areas where we might be able to get people, and we know that there are people out there who are regularly treading the hills in our north and west. Why don't we get them to stick out an acoustic recorder at the same time? In terms of more adaptation, could we use the approach that we've used in Upland Rovers to sample other parts of the UK? Other areas where it's a completely different challenge include the fenlands of Lincolnshire and Cambridgeshire, where I live. Very difficult to get coverage there simply because of land access. Could we adapt a similar arrangement where you pick a square, you go there once, and you need not go back ever again? I haven't talked at all about the Waterways Breeding Bird Survey, but that is what you might consider BBS's sort of sister survey, and that's undergoing a review at the moment and under development with a view to thinking about maybe changing the way we market it, if you like, to volunteers, changing its methods, changing the way that recording is done. And of course, the big question that's probably on a lot of people's lips is, will we ever let people use the auto ID in the field? So using apps like Merlin to help them with their bird surveys. The answer right now is no thank you, mostly because we're not sufficiently confident in what it puts out, but that's not to say that in the future we can't necessarily think about doing so. So I'd like to say thank you to everyone in the room for your attention, but I just want to say a big thank you to the 9,000 people, of which each one is named in very, very, very small letters here, for the contribution to the BBS and for those 30 years, and I very much look forward, at least personally for the next 5, but also, who knows, for the next 30 years in the service. Thanks very much.